The snow had been falling for 6 hours without pause. By 11 in the evening, Manhattan had gone quiet in the way only a blizzard could manage. Not silent, but muffled. The city's usual restlessness pressed down beneath 3 inches of white. On the 45th floor of the Meridian Financial Tower on 6th Avenue, none of that mattered. The windows were sealed, the climate-controlled air held at 68 degrees, and the woman standing at the head of the conference table had not looked outside once in the past 4 hours. Evelyn Carter had other things to see. She was 29 years old, and she ran Carter Dynamics the way she had built it, with precision, with speed, and with an almost religious faith in systems. Not just software systems or security systems, but the broader architecture of how decisions got made, how information flowed, how risk was quantified and neutralized before it could breathe. She had founded the company at 24 out of a Columbia dorm room, on the back of a proprietary data processing model that could reconcile financial transactions across 7 currencies in under 40 milliseconds. 5 years later, Carter Dynamics processed $17 billion in institutional transfers per quarter. Tonight's signing, a merger agreement with a Swiss asset management firm called Aldrich Capital, was worth $430 million. It had taken 11 months to negotiate. The lead counsel from each side was present, 2 senior partners from the underwriting bank, a notary, a photographer from the company's internal communications team, and, stationed at the 3 entry points to the executive floor, 4 members of the contracted security detail from Vanguard Protective Services. One of them was new to this floor. He had transferred up from the lobby rotation 3 weeks ago. His name was Daniel Hayes, and he was 38 years old and built like a man who had learned long ago that the body was a tool, not a trophy. Lean, economical, nothing wasted. He wore the standard-issue Vanguard blazer and kept his hands at his sides. He did not chat with the other guards. He did not check his phone. He stood at his post near the eastern elevator bank and watched, not the way most security personnel watched, scanning for anomalies with the anxious energy of someone waiting to be tested. Hayes watched the way certain people watch, absorbing, processing, filing, the way a doctor reads a room full of patients. At 11:17 p.m., he crossed the floor toward Evelyn Carter. She was reviewing the final signature pages with her general counsel, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Wold, when she registered the approach from her peripheral vision. She did not look up, Miss Carter. His voice was even, not deferential, not pushy. Factual. She looked up then. You're the new transfer, Hayes. Yes. He stood at an appropriate distance, not hovering, not retreating. I'd like to request a 10-minute hold on the signing ceremony. Wold looked over her reading glasses. The room stirred slightly. One of the Swiss attorneys glanced up from his phone. On what basis? Evelyn asked. I've observed several anomalies in the past 40 minutes that I'd like time to verify. Individually, each one has an innocent explanation. Together, they form a pattern I'm not comfortable with. Evelyn set down her pen. She gave him the full weight of her attention, not unkindly, but with the particular quality of focus that had made more than one senior executive rearrange their thinking in under 30 seconds. What kind of anomalies? I'd rather not enumerate them in the open. If I could have, I don't have 10 minutes, she said. This signing was delayed twice already. Our Swiss counterparts have an 8 a.m. flight. The underwriters have a second closing in Boston tomorrow. She gestured at the table, at the lawyers, at the assembled machinery of a transaction that had consumed nearly a year of her company's effort. Walk me through it right now, in 30 seconds, or stand down. Hayes looked at her. Just for a moment, not long enough to be insubordinate, long enough to communicate that he was choosing his next words with care. There's a delivery vehicle that's been parked in the loading bay for 54 minutes. The badge that cleared the 43rd floor at 11:08 was issued last week. That's unusually recent for a building with a 6-month vetting window. And I've had 2 radio contacts drop out in the past 25 minutes, each for 3 to 4 seconds. A brief silence. Then Patricia Wold said, quietly but distinctly, Radio interference in a glass and steel tower in a snowstorm is not unusual, Mr. Hayes. No, he agreed, it isn't. And late deliveries. Understood. He didn't argue. He absorbed the objection. I'm not asking you to cancel. I'm asking for 10 minutes. Evelyn looked at him for one more second. In her experience, security personnel who flagged problems either did it constantly, turning every shadow into a threat, which made them useless, or they flagged genuine problems with the calm specificity of someone who had learned to distinguish signal from noise. Hayes was doing the second thing. She knew this. She signed the first document anyway. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Please return to your post. The room relaxed. Someone made a quiet joke about the weather. The Swiss attorney uncapped his pen. Across the floor, Daniel Hayes walked back to the Eastern Elevator Bank, stood at his post, and watched. The thing about pattern recognition is that it isn't magic. It's compression. Most people, confronted with 10 separate data points, evaluate each one in isolation. A delivery truck running late, a new badge, radio static. 3 incidents, each with a plausible explanation, discarded and forgotten before the fourth arrived. The pattern never assembles because no one is holding all the pieces at the same time. Hayes had been holding them for 40 minutes. He had learned this not in a classroom but in the kinds of rooms that don't appear on any organizational chart: forward operating positions, embassy perimeters, extraction corridors in cities where the rule of law was a formality. And the real governing structure was invisible. Until it suddenly, catastrophically wasn't. He had learned to hold the pieces, to resist the human impulse to explain each anomaly away as soon as a reasonable explanation presented itself, to wait. Waiting was not passivity. Waiting was the active accumulation of data without premature conclusion, the deliberate suspension of judgment until the picture was complete enough to trust. He had paid for this skill in the only currency that bought it. Time. Repeated failure. The specific, irreversible education of being wrong in conditions where being wrong had consequences you carried for years. The delivery truck, a catering company called Riverside Provisions. Their logo was on the side of the van. Hayes had looked up the company on his phone at 10:48 p.m. and confirmed they were real, licensed, operational, 300 reviews on Yelp. But real companies had dispatchers. Real dispatchers knew how long a delivery took: 54 minutes at a loading bay for a catering drop in a building with no event scheduled on floors above 30 was either negligence or cover. The badge. He had asked the front desk supervisor, Candace, to pull the issuance record. She had done it, somewhat reluctantly, and confirmed the badge had been issued 9 days ago to a facilities management contractor, a subcontracted role with broad access permissions, because broad access permissions were convenient and no one wanted to have an argument with a contractor who needed to get to the utility rooms on multiple floors. 9 days was not inherently suspicious, but combined with everything else, it was a door left open. The radio dead zones. 3 seconds was consistent with interference. 4 seconds was consistent with a low-power jamming device operating in short pulses, the kind designed to disrupt without triggering the building's RF monitoring system, which only flagged sustained interference. And then there was the one thing he hadn't mentioned to Evelyn Carter, because it wasn't a fact he could articulate cleanly. It was a behavior. One of the men who had come through the 43rd floor 20 minutes ago, a tall figure in gray work clothes carrying a toolbox, had walked in the direction of the utility stairwell, and then, very briefly, stopped. Just for 2 seconds, he had looked at the ceiling-mounted camera above the stairwell door, then looked away and continued walking. Most people looked at security cameras. It was a normal reflex. You see a lens pointed at you and your eyes go to it. But this man had looked at it first, then at the door handle, and his body had adjusted infinitesimally, imperceptibly to anyone, not specifically watching for it toward the camera's blind spot before he turned the handle. He knew where the camera was. He had located it before he approached the door. That wasn't a technician. That was someone who had studied the floor plan. Hayes stood at his post near the Eastern Elevator Bank and did not move. He tried his radio again. Candace at the front desk crackled in and out. He switched to Channel 4. Silence. He considered his options. He had been told to stand down. His supervisor, a Vanguard manager named Glenn, stationed on the 42nd floor, was not responding. The in-house security team led, a man named Ron Castillo, was on break. Hayes looked at the conference room through the glass partition. Evelyn Carter was signing the third document in the stack. She was efficient. They would be done in 12 minutes at the current pace. He calculated 12 minutes against what he knew. He moved to the service corridor. The flaw in Evelyn Carter's model was not arrogance. That would have been too simple, too easy to correct. The flaw was architectural. She had built Carter Dynamics around the principle of verified intelligence. No decision without data. No action without confirmation. This had served her extraordinarily well. It was the engine of the company's growth, the reason she had outperformed older and better capitalized competitors who operated on gut feeling and relationship capital, and the kind of confidence that looked like leadership until it didn't. But the principle had a shadow. Verified intelligence was only as good as the verification system. And the verification system, like every system, had been designed by humans, operating in a specific threat environment. It accounted for the risks those humans had imagined. It could not account, by definition, for the risks they hadn't. She had not imagined this one. There was a deeper irony in this, though she would not see it clearly until much later. The same quality that had made her exceptional, the insistence on evidence, the refusal to be moved by intuition without supporting data, was precisely what made her vulnerable to a threat that operated below the threshold of documented evidence. The attackers had planned for a system like hers. They had studied it. They had designed their operation to produce nothing that Carter Dynamics' threat intelligence framework would classify as actionable. No electronic signals, no flagged communications, no suspicious transactions in the days prior. Nothing that would clear the verification bar. The only thing that had fallen below their planning was one man standing at a post who looked at things with eyes that weren't connected to any system at all. The signing proceeded. Patricia Wold was reading aloud the closing conditions for the benefit of the record. The Aldrich Capital lead, a white-haired Austrian named Reinhard Fuchs, was nodding at each clause. Two junior associates were initialing exhibit pages. The photographer was moving around the perimeter of the table, documenting. At 11:39 p.m., Evelyn noticed that the guard she'd posted near the elevator bank Hayes was no longer at his station. She frowned, made a mental note to address it after the signing. At 11:41 p.m., the second guard, a man named Terrence, was also gone from his position near the main entrance. Evelyn looked at this for 3 seconds. She was about to ask Patricia to pause the reading when she heard, from somewhere below them, a sound that she could not immediately categorize. A mechanical sound, the kind of sound a building made when something large was being repositioned. The elevator doors on the east side opened. 3 men stepped out. The lights died for 2 seconds. The backup generators caught at 2.5. The conference room came back at 70% luminosity emergency protocol. The overhead panels dropping to amber-tinted half power. The exits illuminating in green. In those 2.5 seconds, in the dark, everyone in the conference room was still. The 3 men did not need the light to move. They had already moved. By the time the backup power came on, the configuration of the room had changed. One man heavyset, work clothes, the one from the stairwell, was standing at the main conference room entry with his back to the door. His hand was visible. In it was a compact pistol with a suppressor attached. He said nothing. He did not need to. The second man had moved to the far end of the table, near the windows. He was younger, with a close-cropped beard, wearing a maintenance uniform. He had a weapon, too, held low, and his eyes were moving over the room with professional efficiency, counting bodies, identifying variables, calculating. The third man went directly to Evelyn Carter. He was the tallest of them, and the most controlled. He put his left hand on her shoulder and turned her body with a specific, practiced pressure, not violent, but absolute. He said, close to her ear, the name of the vault room on the 44th floor. And he said a number. And he told her what he needed. The Swiss attorney made a sound. The first man at the door raised his weapon slightly. The room fell completely silent, except for the hiss of the wind against the glass 45 stories above 6th Avenue. Evelyn Carter felt, for the first time in 5 years, that a system had failed her. Not hers. Her. She had dismissed a man who was watching what no one else was watching. And now 3 men with suppressed weapons were standing in her conference room, and one of them had his hand on her shoulder. She was afraid. She was also, underneath the fear, running calculations. She was always running calculations. She looked at the room. 12 people, 3 armed men, 2 visible exits. The guard station near the elevator bank where Hayes had been, where Hayes was not. She did not know where Hayes was. She did not know if he was neutralized or gone or somewhere in the service corridor doing something she couldn't see. She thought about him very briefly, about the specific quality of his stillness, the way he had absorbed Patricia Wold's objection without reaction, the way he had said, "I'm not asking you to cancel," and meant it. Then the man behind her said her name again and tightened his grip, and she stopped thinking about Hayes and started thinking about survival. Daniel Hayes was in the service corridor on the east side of the floor when the lights went out. He was already moving. He had spent 11 minutes in the corridor after stepping away from his post, not wandering, not searching blindly, but positioning. He had mapped this floor on his first day of the transfer, the way he mapped every floor he worked, the way he had mapped every building and compound and perimeter he had ever been responsible for. He knew where the structural columns were. He knew the sight lines from the conference room's glass partition. He knew the distance from the service corridor access point to the main conference room entry. He knew it was 22 feet. He also knew that the man at the door, the one he'd watched studying the stairwell camera, would be facing inward, not outward. Crowd control, not perimeter defense, which meant his back was partially exposed to the service corridor access. The lights going out confirmed the timeline. The lights going out told him it was happening now. He waited 4 seconds after the backup power came on. 4 seconds was enough time for the armed men to settle into their initial positions. Movement in the first moments of a takeover was expected, people flinching, shifting. The room reorienting. After 4 seconds, anything that moved would be noticed. He needed them settled. He needed the geometry stable. He pressed himself against the door frame of the service corridor entrance and looked through the narrow gap. 3 men. Positioned exactly as he'd estimated, one at the door, one at the far end, one close to Evelyn Carter. The far one was scanning. The door one was facing in. The third had his attention on Carter and whatever he was saying to her. Hayes assessed the man nearest to him. The one at the door. The one whose back was partially to him. He was right-handed. The weapon was in his right hand. His left shoulder was slightly forward, toward the room. That meant his right side, his weapon side, was the one rotated away from the room's occupants, away from Hayes. This was the geometry Hayes had been waiting for. He looked at the table. He looked at the people at the table. He was looking for something specific. A point of instability. A variable the armed men couldn't fully control. There were tablets on the conference table. 4 of them presentation materials. One was near the edge, close to where Reinhard Fuchs was seated. Close enough that a small shift in posture could... He caught Fuchs's eye through the glass. He did not make a gesture. He simply looked at the man, then looked at the tablet, then looked back at the man, with the quality of attention that communicated intent without moving a single muscle on his face. Reinhard Fuchs was 71 years old and had, in his professional life, survived a hostile takeover, a regulatory investigation, and a skiing accident that required 3 surgeries. He understood, when someone looked at him like that, that information was being transmitted. His elbow moved 2 inches. The tablet hit the floor at the far end of the table. The sound was sharp, the slap of glass and aluminum on polished concrete, and in the compressed acoustics of a room full of terrified people it landed like a gunshot. Every head turned toward the sound, including the man at the door, including the man at the far end, including the man standing behind Evelyn Carter. The geometry shifted for 1.4 seconds. Hayes came through the service door. He moved at an angle, not a straight line, cutting inside the door guard's right side, inside the weapon. He was not running. Running was noise and commitment and telegraphing. He moved fast and low, and with the specific economy of someone who had performed this sequence, or sequences like it in conditions considerably worse than a carpeted conference floor in climate-controlled air. His left hand went to the man's right wrist, ahead of the weapon. His right forearm went to the back of the man's elbow. It was not a dramatic movement. It looked, briefly, like an embrace. Then the man's wrist rotated past its anatomical limit. The weapon left his hand, and he went down. Hayes caught him going down and placed him with almost no sound at all. The way you'd set down something you didn't want to break. The weapon was in Hayes's left hand. Elapsed time, 4 seconds. The man at the far end of the label had turned at the sound. Hayes threw the captured pistol not at the man, but at the displays screen on the wall beside him, 3 feet to his left. The clatter and the flash of movement pulled the man's eyes and weapon for the instinctive half-second that target acquisition requires. Hayes was already across the room. He had covered 22 feet in the time it took for a man to process a sudden movement and start to track it. He went inside the weapon arm, one hand on the wrist, one hand under the chin, and the man hit the far wall and slid down it. Not unconscious, but very still. Very still. The way you become still, when something in your body registers that movement, would be inadvisable. 10 seconds total. The third man, the tall one, still had his hand on Evelyn Carter's shoulder. He had been watching. He had processed the first 2. He now had his weapon pressed against Carter's ribcage, and he was backing up, toward the window. And his eyes were on Hayes with a flatness that was more frightening than panic would have been. "Don't," he said. Hayes stopped moving. He stood 11 feet away and looked at the man. He was breathing normally. Not because he was calm, the calculation in his body was enormous, running at a speed and depth that had nothing to do with calm, but because breathing was mechanical, and he had long ago learned to keep the mechanism running regardless of the content. "You're holding her wrong," Hayes said. The man blinked. It was involuntary. The statement was so structurally unexpected in its content, in its register, in the fact that it implied Hayes had a preference about technique, that it created a half-second of cognitive pause. The man adjusted his grip. He moved the weapon from Carter's ribcage to her shoulder, tightening his forearm around her neck, a more secure position, a classic defensive posture, and in doing so he shifted his own center of gravity backward and brought his weapon arm slightly forward, away from the body it was protecting. Hayes had moved before the adjustment completed. 1 step, inside the weapon arm, his right hand on the man's wrist, his body between Carter and the barrel. Carter felt the pressure on her neck release suddenly, completely, and then she was stepping sideways, and there was a sound behind her that was not a gunshot, and then nothing. She turned around. All 3 men were down. Daniel Hayes was standing in the middle of the room, and he was not breathing hard. The NYPD Emergency Service Unit arrived at 11:54 p.m. 6 minutes after the last man went down, the doors opened, and the floor was suddenly full of people in tactical gear moving in the deliberate, saturated way of a well-rehearsed response, securing the perimeter, confirming the injured, separating the witnesses. Someone pressed a chemical ice pack into Evelyn Carter's hand. She held it without knowing why for a full minute before she realized her palm was bleeding, that she had dug her nails in without noticing. The 12 people who had been in the conference room were escorted to the secondary conference room on the west side of the floor. And they sat there in a state that wasn't quite shock and wasn't quite relief. The Aldrich Capital lead, Reinhard Fuchs, was very still. His hands, which had spent 40 years signing documents worth hundreds of millions of dollars, were resting flat on the table in front of him, and he was staring at them as though confirming they still functioned. Patricia Wold was on the phone quietly, efficiently, already managing the legal and notification implications, already doing what she did, because doing what she did was how she dealt with everything. The 2 junior associates sat side by side and said nothing. The Vanguard photographer had his camera on the table and was looking at it the way a person looks at an object that used to make sense to them. No one said much. There wasn't a register for it, in ordinary professional language, what had just happened. No vocabulary that adequately covered the experience of watching a man dismantle a hostage situation in under 11 seconds while you were sitting at a conference table with a pen still in your hand. They found the Vanguard guard, Terrence, in the 4th floor stairwell, zip-tied and conscious. a lump developing above his left temple where he had been struck from behind. He was angry and embarrassed and uninjured in any serious way. They found Glenn, the Vanguard floor supervisor, in a maintenance closet on 42, similarly restrained, similarly furious. They found Hayes sitting in a chair near the window with his jacket off, and a paramedic examining a cut on his forearm, not deep, not serious, the result of the glass from the tablet that had shattered on the floor during the sequence. He was answering a detective's questions in the same even, factual tone he had used when he stood in front of Evelyn Carter 40 minutes earlier and asked for 10 minutes. Evelyn watched him from across the room. The feeling she had was not simple. It was not gratitude. Though gratitude was in it. It was not guilt. Though guilt was in it too. The feeling was primarily structural, the sensation of a load-bearing wall in a mental architecture being revealed as false, and having to stand in the rubble of that realization while also managing the immediate aftermath of a crisis, and not having the time or the capacity to process either one fully. She watched him answer the detective's questions with the same patience he'd had when standing in front of her. He gestured once toward the service corridor, explaining his route. He paused to confirm a detail the detective had asked him to repeat. He did not embellish anything. He said what he'd seen and what he'd done, and where each of the three men was now, and what condition they were in, with the precise, effectless quality of a professional completing an after-action report. No one was looking at him the way they looked at someone who had done something extraordinary. Everyone in the room was looking at him the way they looked at someone who had done something they could not fully categorize, and were therefore uncertain how to treat. Except Detective Sandra Okafor, who came to stand beside Evelyn. "He asked you to delay the signing," Okafor said. It wasn't a question. The detective had been reviewing the conference room logs. "Yes." "And you declined?" "Yes." Okafor looked at Hayes across the room. "His background is going to be interesting reading," she said, with the particular quality of professional interest that meant she already knew something. Evelyn looked at her. "What do you mean?" Okafor just made a note on her pad and moved on. The security clearance documents reached Evelyn's general counsel the following morning at 9:15, forwarded from the NYPD's liaison office at the request of Patricia Wold, who had decided that understanding exactly who had saved their lives was a legal and professional necessity. Evelyn read them at her desk with her second coffee untouched beside her. Daniel Hayes had spent 9 years from age 24 to 33 as a member of a Federal Protective Operations Unit operating under the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service, with secondary assignments to a counterterrorism task force that the file described, in the language of official documents, as operating in high-risk extraterritorial environments. The citations were either classified or redacted. The commendations were not. There were 4 of them. He had left federal service 3 years ago, following an operation that the file referenced obliquely. The language was careful, bureaucratic, but between the lines of what it said and what it conspicuously didn't say, Evelyn could construct the shape of it. An extraction. Multiple principles. A decision point where the optimal outcome was mathematically unavailable, and Hayes had made a choice. The choice had saved more lives than it cost. It had cost one. The name in the file, the one listed under related personnel, non-surviving, was a man named Christopher Brand, 31 years old. The file noted that Brand and Hayes had served together for 7 years. After leaving the DSS, Hayes had spent 18 months doing something the file described as private consulting, international scope, which could mean many things, and probably meant several of them. Then, 14 months ago, he had applied for a position with Vanguard Protective Services. Starting salary, $42,000. Starting position, lobby rotation. Evelyn put the file down. She sat with it for a long time. She was, by nature, a person who converted information into action quickly. The gap between input and response in her professional life was measured in hours, sometimes minutes. She had built a company on that speed, but this was different. This was not information to be processed. This was a picture to be looked at, held at a certain distance, seen whole. She had sat across from a man whose file read like a testament to a specific kind of professional existence that most people never encountered, and almost no one chose twice. The DSS work, the extraterritorial assignments, The commendations that were careful not to say exactly what they were commending. She had encountered enough government documents to read between their lines. Hayes had been, for 9 years, the kind of person who went into situations after every other option was gone. The kind of person the system called when the system had run out of other options. And then he had lost someone. And he had come back. The 18 months of private consulting, international scope, she could reconstruct this too, with some confidence. People who left Federal Protective Service didn't immediately stop doing what they knew how to do. They did it for different clients, under different arrangements. Without the documentation, or the commendations, or the institutional oversight. And then, at some point, they stopped. Hayes had stopped. He had stopped and applied for a lobby job, and worked it quietly for 14 months, standing at a door, checking badges, saying nothing beyond what was required, watching rooms, with the eyes of a man who had once been paid to watch rooms in places where watching incorrectly had permanent consequences. She thought about the particular courage of that, not the 9 years of federal service that was a different kind of courage, the kind that ran on adrenaline and mission, and the reinforcement of people around you who were doing the same thing. The courage she was thinking about was quieter. It was the courage to step all the way back, to take a job that offered no recognition, no application of the full range of what you knew, no alignment between your capacity and your context, to stand in a lobby and check badges and be, by every visible measure, exactly what your name tag said you were. She thought about what had made him break from that. 3 weeks into a new floor rotation, he had walked across a room and told her a CEO who hadn't looked up from her documents that something was wrong. He had been right. He had been dismissed. He had gone back to his post, and he had done his job anyway. Without bitterness. Without the kind of injured pride that would have made a smaller person either escalate or disengage. He had gone back to his post, and he had kept watching, and he had found a way to be useful in the window that remained. She looked at the New York skyline. Gray and bright, with the reflected glare of last night's snow, and she thought about a man who had accumulated the kind of knowledge and experience that could stop 3 armed men in under 11 seconds, and who had not been forced, chosen to stand in a lobby and check badges. She thought about what that choice meant. What it said about what the man was carrying. She thought about the specific quality of his stillness. The conference room footage was reviewed at 3 separate points over the following week, once by the NYPD, once by Vanguard's internal affairs team, and once by Evelyn Carter, alone, at 10 in the evening, in her office. She watched it all the way through twice. The first time, she was watching Hayes, his positioning, his movements during the signing, the way he stood at the service corridor door in the few seconds between the backup power coming on and him moving through it. The second time, she watched herself. She watched herself sign the first document without looking up. She watched herself dismiss Hayes with the particular economy of a person who had decided, before the conversation began, what category the conversation fell into, and how much time it merited. She watched the moment Hayes absorbed Patricia Wold's objection, standing still, not arguing, not pressing, and she thought about what that cost him. Not the standing down. The standing down had cost him nothing except the ability to do his job. What it had cost him was subtler. He had been right. He had known he was right, and he had stood down anyway. Because she had told him to. And because the system he was operating inside required him to defer to her judgment, regardless of whether her judgment was better than his. She had built that system. She watched herself sign the next document, and the one after that. Then she called Patricia Wold. "I need to review our security assessment protocols," she said. "Specifically the escalation procedures. And I need to understand what structural features of the way we operate make it difficult for frontline personnel to override a senior executive decision when they have credible threat intelligence." A silence on the line. "That's a significant question," Patricia said. "I know what it is." Evelyn was looking at the paused footage, the frame where Hayes stood in the conference room doorway, and told her he wanted 10 minutes, and she hadn't looked up from the document. "I should have asked it before last night." She met with Hayes the following afternoon. Not in her office, in a small conference room on the 43rd floor. No assistants, no recordings. She had asked Patricia to arrange it, and had asked Patricia not to attend. Hayes came in wearing his Vanguard uniform. He sat where she gestured. He waited. "I watched the footage," she said. "Okay, I made the wrong call." He didn't say anything. He was not going to say "it's all right," or anyone would have, or any of the other available social lubricants that would have made this easier for her. She appreciated this, obscurely. "What you said in the conference room," she said, "about not seeing what you don't think is worth seeing." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "I've said that before," he said. "After situations like this. The version I said to you was quieter. The quieter version was enough." She looked at him steadily. "I run a company that processes $17 billion a quarter, and I built the entire security architecture around verified intelligence, which means I built it around the assumption that the only valid threat signal is one that the system has already learned to recognize." She paused. "That's not security. That's documentation of known threats." "Yes," Hayes said. "You saw something the system hadn't classified, and I dismissed it because the system hadn't classified it." He didn't confirm or deny. He just sat there, very still, and waited for her to arrive at whatever she was arriving at. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's not a corporate statement. I'm telling you directly that I made a bad decision with significant consequences, and I was wrong to dismiss what you brought me." Hayes looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face, not visible enough to name, but present. "Apology accepted," he said. 3 weeks after the incident, Carter Dynamics issued a public statement acknowledging the events of that evening and crediting Hayes by name with preventing what the NYPD had by then confirmed was a planned financial coercion and hostage situation tied to a network of financial fraud spanning 4 countries. The signing had been the target because the Aldrich Capital merger contained a regulatory clause that would have given the perpetrators, had they obtained the vault credentials and a signed instrument under duress, a 48-hour window to move a significant sum before the flag would have registered in the system. Hayes had understood, within 40 minutes of the operation beginning, that something like this was in motion. He had understood it from a parked truck, a 9-day-old badge, and the way a man looked at a camera. The public statement generated considerable attention. Carter Dynamics' communications team fielded calls from 3 national news outlets and 2 financial journalism publications. Evelyn declined all interviews, except one, a brief written statement that she approved personally, which said only, "There are things a system cannot see. Acknowledging this is not a weakness in leadership. Ignoring it is." The offer letter was prepared by Patricia Wold and reviewed by Evelyn 4 times before it went out. The position was titled Strategic Security Advisor, reporting directly to the CEO. The compensation was structured in 3 parts: a base salary, a threat assessment retainer, and an equity participation that vested over 4 years. The letter also included, on the 3rd page, a single paragraph that Evelyn had written herself and that Patricia had not edited. "This role is defined by your judgment, not by the boundaries of any protocol we currently have in place. Your responsibility is to tell me what the system cannot see. Mine is to listen when you do." She had Hayes's direct number from the NYPD liaison documentation. She sent him a text, not to his Vanguard radio, not through a coordinator. His personal phone. The text said only, "The letter is in your email. There's no deadline." Hayes did not respond to the text that day. Or the next. He read the letter 3 times on the first day. He did not respond because he had learned, at some cost, that the decisions that mattered required more than one sitting. You could understand a thing completely and still not know what it meant for you. Those were separate processes. And collapsing them, deciding before you knew, or knowing without deciding, was how people ended up in positions that cost more than they'd planned to pay. He went to work. He stood at his post on the 45th floor, which was now temporarily vacant of executives, while the investigation and cleanup and insurance processes ground through their various gears. He stood there and watched the empty conference room through the glass partition, the table with its dossiers removed, the chairs pushed in, the display screen dark, and he thought about what had happened in it, and what it had meant, and what he was going to do. He thought about Christopher Brand a great deal during those days. Not the way he usually thought about Brand, the sharp, specific grief of a specific memory, but in a broader way, a more questioning way. Brand had been the kind of person who moved toward things. That had been his nature. Constant forward momentum. The inability to stand still when there was something happening nearby that he could affect. It had been, in the end, the thing that got him. And Hayes had spent 3 years since then finding ways to stand still. To stand at a lobby desk and check badges. To stand at a post and watch a room. To not move toward things. He was honest with himself about why. It was not grief alone, though grief was present. It was the specific, quiet dread of being wrong again in a high-stakes situation, of making a decision in a corridor and having it cost someone, of being the person in the room who could read the situation most clearly and using that clarity to make a choice that another person died for. He could not guarantee he would not do it again. The decision he had made in that corridor had been the right decision. He had saved more people than he lost. The mathematics were not in question. What was in question was whether he was prepared to be, again, the person who made those calculations, the person for whom the mathematics were available at all. He thought about the night in the conference room. He had not planned to move through that service door. He had not decided. He had assessed, and the assessment had produced a course of action, and his body had followed it, the way it always had. The way it had been trained to over 9 years of operations. The decision-making had not been anguished. It had been fast and clear and completely without ceremony, and 3 men were on the floor, and everyone else was standing. He had not lost anyone. He thought about this carefully. He turned it over. He was aware that it was not a guarantee of anything. One successful outcome was data, not pattern. But it was something. On the 4th day, he was in the break room with cold coffee and his phone and the letter still open on the screen. And he read the paragraph Evelyn Carter had written herself one more time. Your responsibility is to tell me what the system cannot see. Mine is to listen when you do. He thought about the 2 protocol changes he knew had been made. He thought about the gap between people who said things and people who did things, and the smaller gap between people who did things and people who sustained them. He did not know which category she was in. He knew which category she was trying to be in. He thought about what Brand would have said. Brand would have said something inadvisable and funny and probably right. And then he would have already accepted the job and moved on to whatever was next. Because Brand had never spent 4 days not answering a text. Hayes picked up his phone. On the 4th day, she was standing at the window of her office at 7 in the morning. The city below still gray with pre-dawn light. When her phone buzzed, it said, I read it. I'll let you know. She looked at the message for a long moment. Outside, the remnant snow on the window ledge was beginning to melt in the thin early light, water moving slowly down the glass in long parallel lines. The city was already moving, already accumulating the data of a new day, already building the conditions of events that no system had yet anticipated. She thought about a man who had spent 9 years learning to read rooms the way other people read documents, who had made a decision in a city she would never visit, in conditions she would never fully understand, that had cost him something he did not discuss, who had come back from that and applied for a lobby job and worked it, without complaint, for 14 months, watching doors. She thought about what it meant that he was still deciding. She put her phone down on the desk and looked at the file, Hayes's file, the DSS documents, the commendations, the redacted report about Christopher Brand, and the extraction and the decision that couldn't be undone, and she understood something she hadn't understood in 11 months of negotiating the Aldrich merger, or in 5 years of building Carter Dynamics, or in 29 years of a life organized entirely around the principle that the right system, properly designed, could anticipate anything. Some people had been somewhere you hadn't been. They had paid for the knowledge they carried in currencies you didn't have a classification for, and the gap between what they knew and what your system recognized wasn't a deficiency in the person. It was a deficiency in the system. She opened her laptop. She started writing. 4 floors below, in the Vanguard break room at the east end of the 41st floor, Daniel Hayes was sitting with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, looking at nothing in particular. The letter was on his phone. He had read it several times. He had read the paragraph she had written herself 3 times more than the rest. Your responsibility is to tell me what the system cannot see. Mine is to listen when you do. He had worked in his professional life for people who said things like this. Several of them had meant it. 1 or 2 had meant it, and had also been able to sustain it to keep meaning it on the 3rd and 4th and 7th occasion when what the system couldn't see was inconvenient or expensive or politically difficult. That was the rarer category. He didn't know which category Evelyn Carter was in. He had watched her, in the weeks since the incident, make 2 specific changes to Carter Dynamics security protocols that had not been announced publicly and were not in the company's official communications. He knew about them because Candace at the front desk had mentioned them in passing a new escalation procedure for security personnel, a new standing authorization for any guard to request a direct 1-minute hold for any signing or transfer event without prior approval from the executive floor. 2 changes, implemented quietly, without fanfare. The kind of changes that cost something, in terms of operational friction, that you only made if you were genuinely persuaded rather than publicly embarrassed. He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it anyway. He thought about Christopher Brand, who had been 31, and who had laughed too loudly at bad jokes, and had been the best person Hayes had ever worked beside in a close space under pressure. He thought about the decision in the corridor in a city he would never name out loud. He thought about the 18 months afterward, and the lobby job, and the particular quality of peace that came from standing in a place where the stakes were low, and the work was uncomplicated, and nobody needed him to be anything he'd once been. He thought about what it meant to step back toward the work. Not the covert work, not the extraterritorial operations, not the decisions that couldn't be undone. The other work, the work of watching rooms, of reading patterns, of being the person in the building who saw what the building systems hadn't yet learned to see. He thought about a woman who had built an architecture around verified intelligence and had been honest enough, after it failed her, to look at the footage of herself and say, "I built it wrong." Brand would have said, "That's the one. That's the kind of person worth working for." Hayes sat with that for a while. The break room was quiet. Below them, Manhattan moved through its morning, generating the data of another day, accumulating the conditions of events that no one had yet anticipated. Hayes set down his coffee cup. He picked up his phone. He opened the letter one more time,